Hello chess players! Today we're going to talk about how to play Ruy Lopez plans from an Italian game move order. So the game starts out e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. We have our Italian game, and we don't intend to play a fried liver against knight f6, and we don't intend to play an Evans Gambit against bishop c5. Instead, what we intend to do is against both the two knights defense and against the Joko piano move order from black, we plan on playing a Ruy Lopez type plan. Basically d3, c3, bishop b3, castles kingside, knight on b to d2, etc. Anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click your notification icon. So you might be wondering, why are we going to play a Ruy Lopez plan from an Italian game move order? Why not play a Ruy Lopez plan from a Ruy Lopez move order, from bishop b5? And that is a fair question. Why not just play the Ruy Lopez? And to that, I have two very good answers. The first one is, they could play the Berlin or they could play the Marshall. Both of those openings have given the Ruy Lopez a ton of headaches on the highest level. A lot of times black is getting draws without ever leaving theory or without ever leaving preparation. And of course, this is also a problem even at the club level. If people know the theory really well for something like the Marshall or the Berlin, it is very difficult to get anything with the white pieces. So that alone should be incentive enough to play bishop c4 and try to go back to your regular Ruy Lopez plans. But there is another incentive as well, which is bishop c4 is just easier to prepare. There's really only three possible moves that you have to worry about here, and if you're planning on playing Ruy Lopez plans no matter what, there's actually only two structures that you need to study. Basically, they can either play knight f6, bishop e7, or bishop c5, and two of those transpose into each other in different ways. So you actually only have two structures that you need to be prepared for. Whereas if you play the Ruy Lopez, you have to be prepared for a ton of stuff. They could play the bird defense, they could play the classical defense, they could play the Berlin, they could of course play the Marshall, they could play the Smyslov variation, they could play the Kozio variation, they could play the Steinitz, they could play the old Steinitz, they could play the Morphy defense. After they play the Morphy defense, that could turn into the Zaitsev variation, it could turn into the Breyer variation, it could turn into the Chigorin variation. They could play the Schliemann, unless I already mentioned the Schliemann. I don't remember because there's so many. And they could play all these different openings against you, and you have to have preparation against all of them, and it is just a nightmare to prepare against all this stuff. So that's the reason you want to play bishop c4. There's only like three lines, knight f6, the two knights defense, bishop c5, the Joko piano, bishop e7, the Hungarian, and those transpose as well, so there's really two structures. So what you're trying to achieve is this Ruy Lopez plan. So they could play, for example, knight f6, d3, bishop c5, c3, and we've achieved the structure. Now we can also achieve this structure from the other move order. We can achieve it from the bishop c5 move order, bishop c5, d3, knight f6, and then of course pawn to c3 is a direct transposition. The other structure that we have to worry about is the Hungarian move order structure. They could start it with bishop e7, which is the mainline Hungarian move order. Now if black does do that, he has to worry about you playing pawn to d4. So a lot of times at the top levels, guys that like to play these structures with black will start with the two knights move order to avoid this possibility of pawn to d4. But then, of course, if they play the two knights move order, they have to worry about knight g5, or they still have to worry about d4, but the variations are quite a bit different. So bishop e7, you could play d3, knight f6, and we're going to have a transposition into this exact same line that could easily begin with knight f6, d3, and then bishop e7. And we're going to end up in the same place. So it's basically just these two structures. We're going to end up here with the bishop on e7, or we're going to end up here with the bishop on c5. That's essentially the two structures that you need to be prepared for when you're preparing the white pieces. And if you're just going to play the Ruy Lopez plans, your basic idea is going to be the same in both. You want to play pawn to c3. Now at this point, I think the easiest way to analyze this is to try to figure out what to do if they don't let you play your normal type plan in this position. So the normal plan would be, let's say they play d6 and we castle and they castle. What happens if everybody just does this and you get to play your bishop b3, etc.? Now you're into your kind of normal Ruy Lopez plans, but what happens if they don't allow this type of thing? What happens if they play, for example, right here, they play an early knight to a5? Now at this point, it's a little tricky, because when they play knight to a5, you actually have to make a big determination on whether or not you're ready to play a move like knight captures e5 in this position, or whether or not it's just more beneficial to play something like bishop to b5. Now in this exact scenario, I think maybe bishop b5 is a little bit better. I think when your king isn't castled yet and you've played c3 in this position, it's not advisable to play a move like knight takes e5, because now knight takes e5, knight takes e5, d5. This is the type of idea that Magnus Carlsen would play against Nepomniachtchi and just equalize really easily. The idea is if you take, they're going to play something like b5. That's to fianchetto the bishop, and then say knight e3, knight takes d5 is basically complete equality for black. But you can get away with this in different move orders. Like if they wait a move to play knight a5. If, for example, with castles and they go ahead and they castle and you play pawn to c3 here. In these cases, if they were to play knight a5 right here with you castled, knight takes a5 should be completely winning. Knight takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes c4. d5 takes, b5 doesn't work as good. Knight a5, and now if they play knight takes d5, note that queen d5 is met with knight c3 because you haven't played pawn to c3 yet. We're going to have queen f5, and then we're going to have rook e1. It's going to be decisive advantage white. And if they play knight takes d5, we're going to have queen f3, which is going to be decisive advantage white. So when we're looking at these positions, the move orders, especially in the early part of the game, are super critical. Whether or not you have a pawn on c3, whether or not you've decided to castle kingside instead of playing pawn to c3, this greatly impacts whether or not they can get away with stuff like knight a5 followed by d5, and how you should respond to it if they do. If you choose this move order beginning with c3 instead of castles kingside, now you have to respond to knight a5 a little bit differently because your king's still in the middle and his king's still in the middle, and knight c3 is not available to you when that queen appears on the d5 square. So now when you play knight takes e5, it's not nearly as good. They're going to play knight takes c4, knight takes c4, d5 takes, b5 is totally legit, because now when everything happens, there isn't going to be this knight coming to c3. And of course, instead of knight e3, knight a5 isn't going to be nearly as effective because now queen b5 cannot be met with knight c3. So these are all, huge problems. So going back, if we look at what to do here, probably bishop b5 is to be recommended. And this was actually played. We had bishop b5, and then we had a6, and the game I'm looking at is Andrikin versus Popov, played back in 2000. And then we have bishop to a4, b5, and then bishop back to c2. And of course now we're back in our regular Ruy Lopez plans. This is kind of what we wanted. So here we have d6, and of course the position is slight edge white, and white's going to start getting those Ruy Lopez type positions, h3, castles, castles, pawn to c5, and after pawn to d4, we honestly, this looks just like a mainline Chigorin variation out of the mainline Ruy Lopez. This is exactly what white was trying to do when he played bishop c4. He was trying to get to some Ruy Lopez-like position, but he wanted to avoid all of that theoretical mess, and in a sense, actually getting to the Chigorin variation via avoiding the Berlin and avoiding the Marshall is a huge success. So here after queen c7, rook e1, say rook d8, knight md to d2, white has a slight edge here. White's actually doing pretty good. And in this game, Andrikin versus Popov, white did go on to win. And of course, you can look at some of my other Ruy Lopez videos, like my Ruy Lopez videos on the Chigorin variation, to look at, exactly how to play these positions. So like d5 is an option and a bunch of other stuff. And a lot of this is preference at this point. So anyways, so going back, so we need to kind of analyze when they can play knight a5 and when that's scary. And we also need to decide in this position whether we want to play c3 in this position or whether we just want to castle. And that's actually a pretty big determination. It's also possible for them to play something like after c3, they could play d6, and then we could castle, and then here we even could worry about this move knight a5 as well. And of course, knight a5 here isn't nearly as scary either. We would play bishop b5 check, pawn to c6, and then we would bring that bishop back to a4, b5, bishop c2. Should actually be major advantage white, at least according to the engine. This was played in Vasikov versus Gusev, played back in 1990. So that game continued with c5, d4, and we again see this very similar thing. This looks a lot like a Chigorin variation of the Ruy Lopez. But of course here, black hasn't gotten an a6. Black's actually down a few moves. He hasn't played a6, he hasn't castled, doesn't have in queen c7 yet. White hasn't had to play a couple different moves here. He hasn't had to play h3 yet, etc., etc. Although here, white did kind of play it in one of the more traditional ways. After queen c7, we had knight mb to d2 in this game, castles, rook e1, rook e8, h3, bishop f8, and then d5. Just claiming the space advantage anyway, and just declaring that he had some sort of advantage in this position. So essentially those are the main things you have to worry about when somebody plays bishop e7. is, are they going to let you play a normal Ruy Lopez-like plan, or are they going to make some early deviation with knight a5? And of course, whether or not you've castled and they play knight a5, or you've played c3 and they play knight a5, you have to deal with that in very different ways depending on which one they do. Basically, as a rule, like if you've played pawn to c3 and they play knight a5, you're probably going to have to play bishop to b5. It's actually just a pretty solid rule. But there are sort of exceptions to that. For example, if you're castled and the c3 square is available for your knight, then knight takes e5 is, of course, very, very reasonable. So those are basically the things you're looking at when you're looking at this knight a5 move. That sort of covers how we're going to play against bishop e7, how we're going to get our normal Ruy Lopez-like position. The other thing that we need to deal with here is what happens when they play bishop c5. This is, in a lot of ways, a little bit easier because we're going to be playing c3 and d4 essentially with tempo. So we should just follow up with c3 right away, and then we're going to see something like d6. Now, one of the main reasons this is a little bit easier is you don't have to worry about knight a5 at any point. Like, if knight a5 right here, you would just play bishop f7, king f7, b4, and you have basically a major advantage with the white pieces. So because the bishop is hanging out on c5, as soon as you play c3, it makes it very awkward for black to get away with knight a5 sort of at any given point. So we're going to have something like d6 here. It is also possible to play other moves. You could play a6, in which case I recommend bishop b3. And again, we're going to have sort of our normal Ruy Lopez-like position. And I have tons of games of theory starting from here. For this game right here is actually Kramnik versus Krasenkow. Kramnik versus Krasenkow continued castles, castles, and then that game continued d5. So basically the theory is going to boil down to two basic plans that black has. Black can either play d6 or d5 in positions like this. When black plays d5, you're going to be targeting the e5 pawn, and that's what happened in the Kramnik versus Krasenkow game. We had d5, e takes d5, knight takes d5, and then we had h3, knight b6, rook e1, and then Kramnik simply targeted this pawn and eventually exchanged it, basically won the pawn on e5 in exchange for losing the pawn on d3. This turned out to be a much better deal for Kramnik, as it turned out. Kramnik actually had a major advantage after queen g3, queen f3, knight f3. We had knight to e7, and then Kramnik made the mistake of knight d3, still had a major advantage after knight d3, but apparently had a winning advantage after just knight takes f7. And then we have rook f7, rook e7, bishop e7, and then knight e5 would have been completely winning. It's reasonable to see why he missed that. King f8, knight f7, and, white's up a clean pawn with a much, much better game. So going back, if they play d5, that's what we have to worry about. Now, other strategies involve d6, and of course they don't have to start with a6, they can just start with d6, and we're going to run into these normal type of d6 positions. Now here we should play bishop to b3. Now, there's a bunch of different games that we can follow here. Like I said, this is very theory heavy. This is the stuff that most of these grandmasters are playing against in these positions. Now, one game is Castles, Castles. This was a Kasparov versus Reynolds game. It went Castles, Castles, and then bishop b3. And then we had bishop e6. And Kasparov won really easily. It went like bishop c2, queen e7, and then, of course, d4, d5 is a threat that black apparently missed. E takes d4, c takes d4, bishop c4, rook e1. The bishop on c5 is hanging. Bishop to b6, knight to c3, aiming at that d5 square. Rook a d8, bishop g5, threatening stuff. h6, knight d5, of course black missed it. Bishop d5, e takes d5, queen d7, and then dc6, taking the knight and attacking the queen, and then messing up the pawn structure around the king, and then just playing for mate. f5, queen takes f5, and then yeah, this is over. King f8, queen h8 is mate. So that's one fun thing that can happen, but unfortunately for most of us immortals, and in the modern era, nobody is going to do that. I don't know how Kasparov managed to get his opponents to make these kind of mistakes, but he got kind of lucky in that regard quite often. But going back to the main line with bishop b3, and again, you should retreat with this bishop b3. It is possible to transpose into that Kasparov versus Reynolds game, depending on their move order. Most people will play a6, knight on b to d7, knight on b to d2, bishop a7, knight f1, h6, knight g3, castles, castles, bishop e6, and then pawn to h3 is following a couple of different games. It's one of the main stem games that I'm following here is Carlsen versus Nakamura, played in London back in 2011. which continued with pawn to h3. Now, it is also possible to play bishop e3 and have both of these bishops kind of face off on the e3 and e6 squares. Now, one of the reasons I think this is super critical as a line and as theory is because this is not a typical thing that you're going to see in the Ruy Lopez. So this is one of the few places where the Italian game set up to play the Ruy Lopez plan is a bit different than the Ruy Lopez. We're not directly transposing into like a Chigorin variation like you would have seen in those other lines. Now, when to take on e6 and when to take on a7 is really important, and it can be the difference between just having a huge advantage and having total equality. For example, this game that I'm looking at here is McShane versus Onashunk that was played in Philadelphia back in 2010. This game continued rook e8, bishop e6, rook e6, and then we had d4 question mark, which is complete equality, apparently, according to the engine. Now, at this point, McShane had the idea he could have played bishop takes a7, which apparently is like decisive advantage white, or at least major advantage white. It would have been bishop takes a7, and then, for example, knight takes a7, d4, rook e8, queen c2, knight h7, rook a d1. And we've got all the normal sort of Ruy Lopez plans, but because all the bishops are gone, these knights on g3 and f3 become super, super powerful. Also, of course, there's a direct threat. We're threatening, d capture c5. The rook is on the same file as the queen. And, of course, you can see both of black's knights are kind of comically out of play. Anyways, the computer seems to love this for white, and it says that this is major advantage white. Now, in the game, of course, McShane played a little bit differently. McShane played the move pawn to d4, and McShane was okay in this position. He did end up going on to win with the white pieces regardless. Now, going back to the other line, after bishop e6, is it of course possible to play pawn to h3, which is kind of the normal plan. This is Carlsen versus Nakamura. That game continued with queen d7, bishop e3, so again we have this bishop face-off. We had knight e7, and then we had knight h4. And after knight to g6, Carlsen planted one of his knights on f5. At this point, white probably has a very slight edge. His knight got to f5 first, and of course it's being supported by the replaceable version of itself, by the knight on g3. And this is the sort of advantage that people are going for, and they can play sort of their normal Ruy Lopez plans moving forward from this position. And as it turned out, Carlsen was able to win from here. This was Carlsen versus Nakamura, played back in London in 2011. So that's basically how you go about the process of playing the Ruy Lopez plans from the Italian game move order. You have to be a little worried about the early move order, especially. You want to get that right. You need to be worried about early knight a5s, especially when they play the Hungarian-type setups, either in the two knights defense move order or via the Hungarian move order. And when you're playing against bishop c5, you have to worry about these situations where the bishops are facing off against each other, and you kind of have to know when to exchange them and when not to exchange them. And that's essentially how you play these Ruy Lopez plans out of the Italian game move order. And as long as the Marshall defense and the Berlin defense are a big problem, you're probably going to have to know how to do this if you want to get results at some of the highest levels. Anyways, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you learned some new ideas. I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.